usually there was a waiting process, as you are aware of, for having a garment made by my grandmother. And sometimes that wait was as long as a year. She stayed quite busy. And the clients, again, as I've said, that she had were, a lot of them were referrals or people that knew of garments that she'd made for someone else. And so, of course, word of mouth spreads quite quickly. And when you're doing the level of work that she was doing and making the quality of garments that she made, it wasn't long before there was a long list of people waiting to have garments made by my grandmother. And she would schedule an appointment with a client, of course, who would come over to the home, sit down with her, and either sketch out a drawing of what they were interested in having made, or they would tell her and she would sketch it based on what she gathered from their description. In some cases, people would bring garments that they had purchased somewhere else, for instance, and give her a visual of what they were looking for in addition to any changes that they'd like to have made. And after meeting with the client, she'd take the measurements of that person, and she would begin the process of kind of mentally preparing what she thought the garment was supposed to look like. That would be the start of that process. I would recall her laying the fabric out and cutting it either based on her own visual measurements for what that garment should begin as a process. And then in some cases, I think I recall her having used what might have been like a cheesecloth or a type of very thin tissue to cut a pattern that she made and created for the dress, at which point she would pin those pieces onto a form, a dress form, and fit it according to what the measurements she had to start. And then, of course, obviously, she would meet with the client again for their first fitting as a rough draft and alter the garment based on what it should have fit like for that particular client. I think each of the sisters obviously were very talented seamstresses. However, I think Aunt Lizzie in particular, her focus was more on beadwork. And she was extraordinary in that area. And so they relied very heavily upon her for, handling a lot of the beadwork when they would collaborate on projects. Aunt Mill and Aunt Chloe were both also very good seamstresses. And each had their own client base. When they would collaborate would typically be when there was a need for, if they were in a time crunch and there was a need for all of them to come together to make sure that the project was finished on time, but as well finished to the degree of quality that they had expectations for. Not really knowing them as individuals coming in as a client, having worked with them on these projects or bringing in a request for a project gave them, a lot of the people, and a lot of them were white clients, the opportunity to really know more about my grandmother and her sisters and learn that they were not just talented seamstresses, but very educated African American women of a very proper upbringing, as they referred to it at that time, who in and of their own right should have been and were well respected in the community.